There is a rule that every engineer, every scientist, and every civilization on Earth has followed for thousands of years without a single exception. You do not pump salt water into a desert, not because it is difficult, not because the technology did not exist, but because salt water destroys land. It poisons soil, it crystallizes underground and turns the earth into a hard, white, lifeless crust where absolutely nothing will ever grow again. The Romans knew this. They salted the fields of Carthage after destroying the city specifically so the land would never recover. That is how bad salt water is for the ground beneath your feet. So when China announced it was going to pump trillions of liters of ocean water across 1,500 kilometers of mountains and empty desert, not to drink it, not to dump it, but to turn the most hostile land on the planet into living, breathing forest, every expert in the room told them the same thing. That is impossible. And this is where the story starts. Because before we go any further, if you are someone who gets genuinely excited when humans do things that were not supposed to be possible, things that break the rules, change the map, and make scientists look twice, then you are in exactly the right place. Hit subscribe and click the like button right now. My name is Addy Mel, and this channel exists for one reason: to find the stories happening right now that the rest of the world has not figured out are important yet. New video every week. Turn on notifications so you do not miss what is coming next. Now, let us talk about what happens when you decide to move an ocean. To understand what China did, you first need to understand what was happening underneath their feet. If you draw a line across the middle of China and look at both halves, they might as well be two completely different planets. The southern half is wet, green, and full of rivers. The Yangtze River alone carries more fresh water than most countries will ever have access to in their entire history. Rain comes reliably. Reservoirs fill on schedule. Farmers in the south have not worried about water for generations. Now look north. The northern half of China holds roughly 1/3 of the entire country's population. It is where some of the largest cities on Earth are located. It is where an enormous portion of the country's food is grown. It is where massive industrial zones run 24 hours a day consuming water by the billions of liters. And that entire half of the country sits on less than 10% of China's total fresh water supply. 10% of the water. 1/3 of the people. Do the math on that, and it is already alarming. Now factor in what happened next. For decades, the North survived by doing what seemed like the obvious thing. They pumped water out of the ground. Ancient reserves that had been slowly building up underground for thousands of years, layer by layer, drop by drop, over millennia. It felt limitless because it was so deep and so vast that nobody could see the bottom of it. But there is no such thing as a limitless underground lake. And China was pumping it out faster than anyone had projected. Faster than the infrastructure was designed to handle. Faster than the aquifers could even begin to replenish themselves. And then the ground started to move. Not in an earthquake, not dramatically. Just slowly, steadily, year after year, the cities of northern China began physically sinking. Not metaphorically, literally dropping in elevation as the water was removed from beneath them and nothing replaced the empty space. In some areas, the subsidence was measurable in full meters. Buildings developed cracks that engineers could not explain. Roads buckled without any obvious cause. Infrastructure that had been designed with one set of ground conditions suddenly found itself sitting on something completely different. While the cities were sinking, the desert was advancing. The Gobi Desert, one of the largest and most aggressive desert systems in all of Asia, was creeping southward and eastward at a rate that shocked researchers who had spent their careers studying it. Sand dunes were appearing in places that had been productive farmland just a single generation earlier. Villages that showed up clearly on maps from the 1980s were completely buried under sand by the early 2000s. Roads built to last 50 years were swallowed in 10. Dust storms originating deep in the desert were traveling hundreds of miles and turning the sky over Beijing a thick, hazy orange in the middle of the afternoon. These were not gentle weather events. These were storms that shut down airports, closed schools across entire provinces, and sent hundreds of thousands of people to hospitals with respiratory conditions that doctors had never seen at that scale before. In the worst years, the dust from China's northern deserts blew all the way across the Pacific Ocean and was detected in air quality monitors along the west coast of the United States. Scientists could measure Chinese desert particles in the air above California. That is how much sand was being lifted into the atmosphere every single day. Farmers were watching their wells go dry in real time. A well that used to hit water at 30 meters had to be drilled to 100 meters, then deeper, then nothing at all. Families that had worked the same land for generations were facing the very real possibility of having to pack everything they owned and leave forever. Scientists were publishing reports that nobody in government particularly wanted to read, laying out in cold, precise language which regions would need to be evacuated first and on what timeline if the current trajectory continued. The sand was not creeping, it was charging, and the most alarming part was not how far it had already come, it was the acceleration. Decade by decade, the rate of advance was speeding up, not slowing down. More land lost per year in the 90s than in the 80s. More again in the 2000s, as if the desert was somehow learning how to move faster the more ground it took. The human cost was immense and largely invisible to the outside world. Entire communities built by parents and grandparents, with schools, temples, markets, and histories stretching back centuries, simply ceased to exist. People packed what they could carry and moved to already overcrowded cities, trading a dying village for a cramped apartment and a future their grandparents would not have recognized. Agricultural knowledge accumulated over hundreds of years, which crops grew best in which soil, how to read the seasonal water patterns, how to coax a harvest out of land that gave you almost nothing, all of it went unused because the land it applied to was gone. The question was no longer whether something drastic needed to happen. Everyone agreed something drastic needed to happen. The question was whether anything drastic enough actually existed. It turned out that it did. It just required rethinking what was physically possible at a scale that had never been attempted before in all of human history. The first move was something engineers and politicians had been debating for decades without ever fully committing to it. If the South had water it could not use and the North was dying from lack of it, why not connect them? Simple question. Almost incomprehensible answer. The South to North Water Transfer Project is the largest water-moving infrastructure ever built by human hands. Nothing else in recorded history comes remotely close to it in scale, in complexity, or in the sheer audacity of what it attempted to do. It stretches 4,345 kilometers across China. To give you a number you can actually feel, that is longer than the straight-line distance from London to New York City. It runs along 3 entirely separate routes. One follows the eastern coast of the country, one cuts directly through the middle. One carves its way through some of the most challenging mountain terrain in western China. Together, they do not function like a plumbing project. They function like a second river system, one that was designed on paper, constructed by human workers, and switched on by engineers who had spent their careers preparing for this moment. The numbers attached to it are almost too large to process. The full system is designed to move 44.8 billion cubic meters of water every single year. Every year, without stopping. That is enough to fill 18 million Olympic swimming pools annually, continuously, without interruption. To build it, engineers had to bore thousands of tunnels through solid mountain rock in conditions where conventional equipment either broke down or could not fit. They constructed hundreds of river crossings using techniques that had to be invented specifically for this project because nothing that had been done before came close to addressing the problems they were facing. They developed entirely new methods for maintaining water pressure across distances so long that the physics of the problem had never been worked out at that scale before any previous engineering team had attempted it. Entire towns were relocated to make way for the route, not small towns. Communities with thousands of residents who had to be moved, compensated, and resettled. A logistical challenge that would have been the entire story of any other infrastructure project. But here was just one entry in a very long list of obstacles. By 2022, the eastern and middle routes combined had already delivered more than 50 billion cubic meters of water to the north. More than 140 million people now receive water from this system every single day. Beijing, which was genuinely approaching a crisis point as its underground reserves collapsed faster than anyone had publicly acknowledged, stabilized. Aquifers that had been dropping for decades stopped falling and began, slowly, to recover. Farms that had been dying came back to life. By any honest measure, it is one of the most remarkable engineering accomplishments in modern history. But the engineers who built it understood something important even as the final sections were being completed. The cities were saved. The groundwater crisis was stabilized, but the desert was still moving. The sand did not care about pipes and tunnels and pump stations. It kept advancing, kept swallowing land, kept grinding southward as if nothing had changed. If the goal was to keep the cities alive, they had succeeded. But if the goal was to actually stop the desert, to push it back, to reclaim the land, to reverse what had taken generations to destroy, then something else entirely was going to be needed. Something that went far beyond rerouting rivers. Something that required rethinking an assumption so fundamental that it had been treated as an absolute law of engineering since the beginning of recorded time. At some point in the planning process, an engineer looked at a map, looked at the problem, and asked a question that made everyone else in the room go very quiet. What if we use the ocean? You can understand the silence that followed, because using seawater is not just difficult. By conventional engineering wisdom, using seawater anywhere near land you want to grow things is one of the worst ideas a person can have. Saltwater does not just fail to help plants grow, it actively destroys the soil it touches. The salt draws moisture out of plant roots at the cellular level, crystallizes inside the soil structure, and turns the ground into a hard, dense, lifeless crust where nothing will grow for decades, sometimes for centuries. The Romans knew this with enough precision that they used it as a weapon of permanent destruction. They salted the fields of Carthage after razing the city specifically because they wanted the land to stay dead. That is the reputation seawater has had in engineering for thousands of years. Not a resource, a weapon against the earth itself. So the idea of moving ocean water hundreds of kilometers into a desert sounded less like infrastructure planning and more like deliberate sabotage. But the engineers were not proposing to pour it directly on the ground. They were proposing to clean it first. And the way they figured out how to do that at a scale and cost that nobody had achieved before, that is the part that actually changes everything. The physical challenges of moving seawater long distances are genuinely different from moving fresh water, and the engineering had to be rebuilt from scratch to account for them. Seawater is approximately 2.5% heavier than fresh water. That sounds like a rounding error until you are pushing it through a pipe for 500 kilometers. At that point, the extra weight creates massive friction against the pipe walls, builds pressure at every bend and junction, generates heat that accelerates corrosion, and attacks metal at a rate that would destroy a conventional pipeline in years rather than the decades it needs to operate. Then there is the phenomenon engineers call water hammer. Imagine a heavy truck loaded with cargo driving at full speed on a highway and hitting the brakes instantly. Everything inside the truck slams forward with enormous force. The same physics happen inside a pipeline when a pump station suddenly stops operating. Billions of liters of heavy, fast-moving liquid have nowhere to go, and they slam into the nearest closed valve with force capable of splitting industrial steel pipe wide open like a tin can under a boot. The engineers could not simply build a larger version of existing pipeline technology. They had to invent something new from the ground up. Specialized pipe coatings that resist salt corrosion the same way heat shields resist the extreme temperatures of atmospheric re-entry on a spacecraft. Computer-controlled pump stations distributed across hundreds of kilometers, coordinated by a central monitoring system to work in careful synchronization, not hammering water through all at once, but pulsing it forward in gentle, coordinated waves that managed pressure without ever letting it spike to dangerous levels. Pressure sensors woven throughout the network that could detect weakness forming in a pipe wall before it became a rupture, giving maintenance teams time to respond before the system failed. New construction methods for laying pipe across terrain with no roads, no shade, no infrastructure of any kind, and temperatures that swing from brutal heat during the day to near freezing at night, conditions that would destroy conventional equipment and the crews operating it. All of that technology needed to be proven before it could be trusted at full scale. You do not build a 500-kilometer pipeline with experimental materials in a remote desert and hope the physics work out. You test it somewhere first. You build proof. The proof appeared from an unexpected direction. A country on the other side of the world dealing with its own version of the same crisis. In 2025, China signed a major infrastructure contract with Iraq worth billions of dollars. The goal was to build a pipeline network stretching from the Persian Gulf deep into the Iraqi desert interior, roughly the distance from Paris to Warsaw, covered in specialized anti-corrosion pipe, precision pump stations, real-time pressure management systems, and monitoring infrastructure running continuously across some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Now here is the part that makes this more than a simple engineering contract. Nobody was planning to drink this seawater. And nobody was planning to pour it anywhere near crops or soil. Instead, It was going to be injected deep underground into Iraq's aging oil fields. Here is why that matters. When an oil field gets old, the natural underground pressure that used to push oil toward the surface drops. The oil is still there, sometimes enormous quantities of it, but it just sits, unable to move on its own. The traditional engineering solution was to pump water underground to push the remaining oil out from below, using hydraulic pressure to do what the Earth's own pressure no longer could. For decades, Iraq had been using drinking water for this process. Clean, drinkable fresh water that could have gone to people, to farms, to cities was being pumped underground just to squeeze more oil out of reservoirs that had already given most of what they had. Billions of cubic meters of water that the country desperately needed for human use was disappearing into the ground every single year. By replacing that fresh water with seawater piped in from the Persian Gulf, Iraq would save those billions of cubic meters of drinkable water annually. Water that could now flow to people, to agriculture, to every purpose it was actually meant to serve. The engineering challenge to make this real was not a small one. The pipeline crosses regions with summer temperatures that would melt standard equipment, unpredictable sand conditions that shift overnight, and essentially no existing infrastructure to build on. Every pump station, every monitoring hub, every maintenance access point had to be constructed from scratch in the middle of empty desert. The anti-corrosive materials used throughout the entire system are the same grade deployed in the most demanding industrial environments anywhere on Earth. Sensors monitor the full network in real time, feeding data continuously to control centers hundreds of kilometers away, where engineers can respond to any anomaly within minutes. And it is working, right now. That pipeline is pumping, the pipes are holding, the seawater is moving exactly as the models predicted. Every kilometer of that system in Iraq is live proof that a pipeline capable of moving massive volumes of corrosive ocean water across hundreds of kilometers of brutal desert terrain is not a theory anymore. It is a tested, functioning, scalable reality. And once you have that proof, once you have moved an ocean across a desert and the pipes held, the next question becomes obvious. What happens when you use that water not for oil, but for the Earth itself? With the technology validated, attention shifted back to one of the most hostile places on the Chinese map, the Taklamakan Desert, sitting in the far northwest of the country, in a region called Xinjiang. The name Taklamakan comes from an old Turkic language, and depending on which translation you trust, it means roughly one thing: you go in, you do not come out. The Taklamakan covers an area roughly the size of Germany and France combined. Sand dunes inside it reach 300 meters in height, taller than the Eiffel Tower, built entirely from loose sand by the wind over centuries. For most of the 20th century, it was growing every single year, pushing outward, consuming the land at its edges, swallowing roads and farms and entire towns that had existed since the Silk Road caravans passed through them 1,000 years ago. China decided to build a greenbelt around the entire perimeter, not a suggestion of trees, not a decorative border for maps and satellite images. A continuous, unbroken ring of living vegetation stretching over 3,000 kilometers, completely encircling one of the largest deserts on Earth, closing the gap between the ends, locking the whole perimeter in place with roots and stems and the slow biology of things that grow. In November 2024, they completed it. The water delivery system that makes this possible uses precision drip irrigation at a scale that has no precedent. Thousands of kilometers of thin tubing laid directly on the desert's surface, each line engineered to carry exactly the right volume of water to the root zone of each individual plant. Not a drop more than necessary, because in a desert, wasting water is not an option. It is a failure the system cannot afford. The plants chosen for the job are not decorative. They were selected because they are built for punishment. A tree called the saxaul is one of the primary species, and it is a remarkable organism. Its root system does not grow straight down the way most trees do. It spreads outward in every direction, threading through sand like a biological net, anchoring the ground in a web of living tissue that the wind cannot dislodge. Once enough saxaul trees establish themselves across an area, the sand dunes stop moving. The surface gets locked in place by roots spreading unseen beneath it in every direction. Once the sand locks, something else begins to happen that the engineers did not fully predict when they first drew up the plans. Wind speeds at ground level drop because the trees disrupt the airflow that was moving the sand in the first place. Humidity near the surface increases slightly as moisture held in the roots and leaves adds to the local microclimate. The extreme temperature swings between day and night, the kind that make most plant life impossible in a desert, become less severe in the shelter of the vegetation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the ground starts becoming capable of supporting more kinds of life than it was designed for. Other plants begin establishing themselves in the shelter of the saxol. Animals return to areas where they had not been seen in decades. Insects reappear. Soil, real, biological soil, the kind that can support an ecosystem rather than just a monoculture, begins to form in places where before there was only sand and rock and dry air. The feedback loop that once worked entirely in the desert's favor, where less vegetation meant more wind erosion, which meant less vegetation, which meant more erosion in an accelerating downward spiral, has been interrupted. In some areas, it has been reversed. Satellite images taken over the last decade show something that genuinely has to be seen to be believed. A visible green line growing wider and thicker and more alive every year, wrapping around the yellow edge of the Taklamakan like a slow embrace. The desert has not disappeared, but it has stopped advancing. And in this particular fight, stopping the advance is already a victory that changes everything. Since 1978, China has been running a program called the Three North Shelterbelt, a decades-long campaign to plant trees across the dry regions of the north. Over 66 billion trees have been planted under this effort. Forest cover in China grew from around 5% in 1978 to over 25% of the entire country by 2024. That is not a rounding error. That is not a reporting artifact. That is a transformation of the physical landscape of one of the largest countries on Earth, documented by satellites that cannot be argued with, confirmed by NASA researchers who had no stake in making China look good, measured in temperature readings and dust storm frequencies and river sediment levels that tell the same story from 5 different directions. More than half of China's previously desertified land has now been restored or stabilized. Desert coverage of the country dropped from 27.2% to 26.8% in just 1 decade. And in a country of China's size, that fraction of a percentage point represents tens of thousands of square kilometers of land that were being swallowed by sand and are now stable or recovering. The dust storms that used to black out Beijing on a regular basis still happen, but far less often and far less severely. Satellite measurements confirm the reduction. Beijing's own air quality records show it year by year. People who lived through the worst of those storms in the 90s and early 2000s say the difference is not just measurable. It is something you can feel in the city. The Yellow River, one of the most important rivers in all of Asia, the water source for hundreds of millions of people, is carrying less sand than it did 40 years ago because there is less sand being picked up and thrown into the air in the first place. And the water? The south-to-north transfer delivers over 12 billion cubic meters every single year to cities and farms that had been running out. The aquifers in northern China that were collapsing are recovering. The ground that was sinking has stabilized. The wells that were going dry are filling again. These are not projections. They are measurements taken from the ground and confirmed from orbit. Here is the question that researchers in Europe, in the United States, in Africa, and across the Middle East are now actively. Can what China did here work anywhere else? A paper published in Nature in 2026 gave the most careful answer the science could support. Yes, with conditions. The conditions matter. China had specific advantages that most countries do not. A central government able to commit to a multi-generational timeline without an election cycle interrupting the funding every 4 years. The financial resources to back that commitment consistently across decades of work that showed slow progress before it showed dramatic results. A large workforce that could be directed and compensated for physical labor in some of the harshest conditions on the planet. And the scientific infrastructure to study what was failing in real time, adjust the approach, and scale up what was working. None of that means other countries cannot do something similar, but it changes what the path looks like. The African Great Green Wall, launched in 2007 to restore land across the width of Africa, just south of the Sahara, is one of the most important environmental projects on Earth and one of the most underfunded. By most honest assessments, it has progressed at a fraction of the speed of the Chinese version, held back by funding gaps, political coordination challenges across many different governments, and the difficulty of getting techniques that work in a small research plot to work at continental scale. The Arabian Peninsula holds some of the wealthiest nations on Earth and some of the most severe water stress simultaneously. Countries there are already importing food grown in other countries because they cannot grow enough locally, and that situation gets worse every decade as temperatures rise and groundwater reserves drop. Central Asia is watching the Aral Sea Basin, once one of the great bodies of fresh water in the world, continue to shrink decade after decade in ways that will not reverse without intervention that nobody has yet organized at the scale required. These are not abstract future problems. They are the defining resource challenges of the next 50 years, already underway, already affecting hundreds of millions of people, already driving the migration patterns and food price volatility and political instability that show up in news headlines without anyone connecting them back to their actual cause. The technologies now exist to begin addressing them in ways that were not possible even a generation ago. The pipeline systems work at scale. The desalination methods have been proven under real conditions. The planting strategies are producing documented results in real deserts. The knowledge base exists, has been tested, and has been refined through decades of real-world application. What happens next depends on political will, on investment, and on cooperation between nations that have not always been good at those things. Water politics is some of the most complicated diplomacy on Earth. Countries that share river systems have gone to war over water. International infrastructure investment comes with geopolitical considerations that recipient countries have to weigh carefully. But the option is on the table in a way it has never been before in all of recorded history. For thousands of years, the relationship between human civilization and geography moved in only one direction. Nature put the water somewhere, and humans followed it. The Nile determined where Egyptian civilization lived. The Tigris and Euphrates determined where Mesopotamian civilization lived. Every city of significance in human history was built around an existing water source because the alternative was not surviving. That deal is being renegotiated right now in the deserts of northwestern China, in the Persian Gulf pipeline running under Iraqi sand, in the satellite data showing a green ring tightening around the Taklamakan year by year. The map is not fixed. A desert that has been on every map for 1,000 years is not necessarily a desert on the ground in 50 years. That is genuinely new. That is a shift in the basic conditions of human civilization that most people have not yet fully absorbed, and it has barely started. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The story you just heard is not finished. The green belt around the Taklamakan was completed in 2024, but whether the roots hold, whether the ecology deepens, whether the model gets picked up by the countries that need it most, is still being decided right now by engineers and scientists and policymakers who are working on problems that most of the world does not even know are being solved. I want to know what you think. If you could use this technology to green any desert on Earth, which one would you choose and why? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know where you land. Hit the like button if this changed how you think about something. Subscribe to Addy Mel so you do not miss what is coming next. We cover the technologies and engineering projects that are quietly reshaping the world while everyone is looking somewhere else. Turn on notifications, because the next video is one of those stories where you will finish it and think, how did I not know about this?